Japanese-American life during and after World War II. The Second World War affected every country and nation in the world. Millions of victims of the war suffered from injustice and the aggressive actions of different parties. The fight against political regimes and leaders was not the only aspect that was typical of World War II. It should be highlighted that it was the war of nations, the war of races. In a fight for survival and well-being, anti-national movements emerged and developed. A lot of people became victims of this conflict. They suffered because of skin color, language, or religion. Japan allied itself with Germany and supported the country in every action directed to influence and change the world order. On the 7th of December in 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor demonstrated the involvement of Japan in the military confrontation. The attack was considered a tragedy for two reasons: many people died, and in addition, the military equipment was destroyed. The primary purpose of this paper is to examine the lives of Japanese Americans during and after the Second World War. The attack on Pearl Harbor proved that Japan had determined its position. Many kamikazes participated in the military operation, which reflected the seriousness of the Japanese government's position. After the tragedy, the government of the United States investigated the attack and concluded that the attack was possible because of the Japanese spies who were members of the Japanese diaspora. It gave the people who worked on the operation of Pearl Harbor an opportunity to perform the attack, as they were able to observe the situation and provide essential information for the Japanese government. One of the fundamental problems for the American government was a moral dilemma centered on the decision of whether or not to isolate Japanese Americans. On the one hand, the U.S. government could not blame all the people. According to recent research, almost 200,000 Japanese Americans lived in the U.S. at that time. Not only would it be just to blame innocent people for the tragedy of Pearl Harbor, but also it would violate democratic principles. On the other hand, the losses at Pearl Harbor were only the beginning of the conflict, and the government realized that the situation could get worse. Thus, since the primary concern of every state is to provide citizens with a safe and secure environment, it was not reasonable to risk the lives and freedom of the American people. In addition, in the legislation of the United States, a law regulating an appropriate decision-making model helped President Roosevelt to choose a direction and act. The law regarding foreigners that threaten the lives of American citizens was adopted in 1798. Furthermore, it is enactable even now. The state can isolate any person if they are suspected of being tied to the hostile state. In such a way, the decision regarding the Japanese internment was made. According to the law, over 120,000 people were forced to leave their place of residence. Among them, almost 70% were citizens of the United States. These individuals commonly lived in the territory of 3 American states, namely, California, Oregon, or Washington. Almost 50% were adolescents. 10,000 people managed to prove in court their ability to be helpful to the American government. Among them were military personnel, engineers, and construction workers. They were not forced to relocate to the camps, although later the government realized that they could not be trusted. For the rest of the Japanese Americans, 10 camps across the country were built, and people had only a couple of days to prepare for the internment. The majority of families abandoned their property as they had no time to sell it and no chance to stay. It is worth highlighting that America supported this action as it was a radical decision that protected the citizens. People in California, Oregon, and Washington supported the internment as well. The Japanese Americans were good merchants, so after the government's decision, Americans could then fill the niche. On March 22, 1942, the first people were relocated. These camps were focused on providing work for the Japanese Americans, who were supposed to work 40 hours a week. In return, they were provided with meals and a place to live. Every camp had hospitals, cinemas, schools, and kindergartens. It is of paramount importance to note that the majority of Japanese Americans were treated respectfully, although 12 people were killed because of attempts to escape the camp. For the most part, people aimed to show a respectful attitude towards the American government and perform their jobs professionally. In 1944, over 20,000 Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the camps. It should be stated that before the end of the war, Japanese Americans could not live close to the ocean. The camp administration provided $25 to every person who was released and chose a new place to reside. When the war ended in September 1945, the Japanese Americans were allowed to leave the camps. In 1948, all the Japanese people received financial compensation for the property they lost during the war because of internment. After the war, the actions of Roosevelt's administration were debated. In the 1980s, the experts claimed that the decision to relocate the Japanese Americans was not based on military need. It could be explained by racial prejudices, military hysteria, and failure of the government in terms of state politics. In 1988, President Reagan signed a document where the government of the United States apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans. Every person who experienced relocation was provided with $20,000 to compensate for their losses. In 1992, the administration of President Bush provided people with an additional $7,000. In conclusion, it should be pointed out that the Second World War influenced every country across the globe. In America, Japanese Americans suffered from the involvement of Japan. The book When the Emperor Was Divine helps the reader to understand the life of Japanese Americans in the camps. The author is focused on providing 4 different perspectives of people who experienced internment. Such literary works help us not to forget historical events and aim to prevent people from making the same mistakes. The book depicts the challenges and difficulties that the Japanese family faced. It was difficult for the families to leave their homes. In the book, it is reflected from the mother's point of view. However, relocation was challenging for children as well. The Japanese boys and girls lost their childish innocence, and it significantly impacted their lives.